Max had always felt a pull toward the natural world, something deep and unexplainable, as if the wilderness spoke to him in ways words never could. For as long as he could remember, he had loved drawing, his sketchbook a constant companion, filled with images of towering trees, flowing rivers, and the ever-changing sky. His fascination with landscapes wasn't just a hobby. It was a way for him to connect with places that felt bigger than himself, places where life existed in its purest form. And there was no place in the world that filled him with as much awe as Yellowstone. Ever since he was little, his family had made the annual pilgrimage to the national park, a tradition that had grown to define his summers. His parents, Sarah and James, had taken him there for the first time when he was 5, and even then, in the haze of childhood memories, he could recall the feeling of wonder, watching geysers shoot columns of water into the sky, seeing bison move in slow, deliberate steps across the vast open fields, feeling the warm, mineral-rich air brush against his face. Every visit had left an imprint on him, as if Yellowstone itself had become part of his identity. Now, at 12 years old, the excitement of returning was as strong as ever. Sitting in the back seat of their SUV, Max watched the landscape shift through the window, the trees growing taller and denser, the roads winding deeper into the wilderness. Rocky, their golden retriever, lay beside him, his head resting lazily on Max's lap, the rhythmic motion of the car lulling him into a peaceful slumber. Max absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the dog's fur, his sketchbook resting on his lap, ready for whatever inspiration struck him. His parents were talking in the front seat, their voices blending with the hum of the tires on the road. Though he wasn't paying attention to their conversation, he caught bits and pieces. Something about the cabins they had rented, the weather forecast for the next few days where they would stop for lunch. None of it mattered much to him. His thoughts were consumed by a single image, the grand prismatic spring. He had seen it before, of course. They had visited it every year, and each time, the sight of it had taken his breath away. The sheer vibrancy of the colors, the deep, surreal blue at its center, the fiery oranges and yellows that stretched outward like flames, the swirling mist rising from its surface, was unlike anything else on Earth. It didn't seem real, as if it had been pulled straight from the pages of a fantasy book. This time, however, he wasn't just there to admire it. This time, he had a mission. He wanted to capture it, not with a camera, not with words, but with his own hands, his own pencil strokes, his own ability to translate what he saw on a paper. That was the thing about drawing nature. Anyone could take a picture, but to truly recreate it, to make someone feel what it was like to stand there surrounded by that untouched beauty, took something different. It took patience, precision, and a connection to the land itself. And for Max, there was no greater challenge than the grand prismatic spring. As the miles stretched on, he felt the familiar sense of anticipation growing inside him, that electric thrill of knowing he was getting closer. The drive to Yellowstone always felt like it took forever, but that was part of the magic. It built the excitement, made the moment of arrival all the more rewarding. Sarah glanced at him through the rearview mirror, smiling. "You thinking about it already?" she asked, her tone warm and knowing. Max nodded. "Yeah." James chuckled from the driver's seat. "I figured. You've been quiet since we left this morning. I just want to see it again," Max admitted. His parents understood. They always did. For years, they had supported his love for drawing, encouraging him every step of the way. They had bought him his first real sketchbook, taken him to parks, nature reserves, anywhere that might inspire him. They had never treated his wheelchair as a limitation, never acted as if the world was out of his reach. Instead, they had always found ways to make sure he could experience everything he wanted to, whether that meant carrying him up a hiking trail or helping him navigate rough terrain. Yellowstone was no exception. When they finally reached the entrance to the park, Max felt his heart skip a beat. The familiar wooden sign stood tall, welcoming them back, and beyond it stretched miles upon miles of raw, untamed wilderness. James rolled down the window as they pulled up to the entrance station, handing their park pass to the ranger. "Welcome back," the ranger said, glancing into the car with a friendly smile. "Been here before?" Max grinned. "Every year. Good place to keep coming back to," the ranger said, handing back the pass. Enjoy your visit. As they drove forward, the landscape unfolded before them. Dense forests giving way to wide, open meadows, distant mountains rising against the horizon. Steam billowed from hidden geysers, drifting lazily into the sky, a reminder of the immense forces lying just beneath the surface. Rocky stirred beside him, lifting his head and sniffing at the air. He knew where they were too. Max felt that familiar rush of excitement, his fingers already itching to start sketching. But he forced himself to wait. There would be plenty of time for that. The grand prismatic spring was waiting. As they made their way deeper into the park, he could feel it, just beyond the trees, beyond the winding roads, beyond everything else. The most breathtaking sight in the world was waiting for him. And this year, he was ready. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the sprawling Yellowstone meadow. The tall grass swayed gently in the breeze, the scent of pine and earth thick in the air. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in bursts of color, violets, reds, and yellows standing boldly against the sea of green. Somewhere in the distance, a river hummed softly, winding its way through the valley like a silver thread. Birds flitted overhead, their wings catching the sunlight as they danced through the sky. Max's fingers moved quickly over the rough surface of his sketchbook, his pencil scratching in short, sharp strokes as he captured the scene before him. His parents, Sarah and James, stood nearby, admiring the beauty of the untouched wilderness, while Rocky, their golden retriever, lay lazily at Max's side, his ears flicking at the occasional sound of rustling leaves. It was the perfect moment, the kind Max lived for. The air was fresh, the world was silent except for nature's whispers, and for a brief, precious time, nothing else existed. No crowds, no buzzing tourists, no one asking if he needed help because of the wheelchair. Just him, his family, and the wild. He exhaled slowly, lost in the motion of his pencil as he shaded the rolling hills in the background. The mountains in the distance had to be just right. He erased a line, redrew it, and then paused, tilting his head. Rocky shifted beside him, letting out a low growl. Max barely noticed at first. The dog sometimes grumbled at squirrels or distant noises. But then came another sound, a deep, guttural exhale, heavy and primal. Max froze. Sarah and James, who had been admiring the view, turned sharply. Then they saw it. A massive grizzly bear stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. The world shrank. The air itself seemed to tighten around them, thick with tension. The bear was enormous. Its fur a mixture of dark brown and golden hues, its powerful shoulders shifting as it moved with slow, deliberate steps. Its snout twitched as it took in the scents around it, its dark eyes locked onto them. Onto Max. No one spoke. No one breathed. Rocky's growl deepened, his body tensing. But he didn't move, as if instinct told him that any sudden action could change everything. Sarah slowly reached for Max's wheelchair handles, her fingers trembling. James, standing beside her, had gone completely still, his hand halfway raised as if caught between the urge to protect and the knowledge that there was nothing he could do against something this powerful. Max didn't move. He couldn't. He had read about bears before, knew the rules. Stay calm. Don't run. Avoid eye contact. But knowing something in theory and experiencing it firsthand were two entirely different things. His heartbeat pounded so loudly he was sure the bear could hear it. And then something strange happened. The bear, towering over them, its breath misting in the cool air, cocked its head ever so slightly. Its eyes softened, not in a way that made it any less terrifying, but in a way that felt knowing, as if it recognized something. It took another step forward, its weight making the ground tremble. The air was thick with the scent of the wild, of musk and earth. Max's fingers tightened around his pencil, his knuckles white. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't feel the same fear that gripped his parents. There was something in the way the bear looked at him that felt different. Not threatening, not angry, curious. For a long, breathless moment, they stared at each other. Max, the boy in the wheelchair with a sketchbook in his lap. The bear, a creature of raw power and instinct, a force of nature. Sarah's breath hitched as she finally whispered, "James." But James didn't move. No one did. And then, just as calmly as it had appeared, the bear huffed, a deep, resonant sound that rumbled through the air, then turned away. It lumbered back toward the trees, its massive body disappearing into the shadows as silently as it had come. Silence hung over the meadow, heavy and suffocating. Then Max let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sarah practically collapsed onto the wheelchair handles, gripping them as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. James rubbed a hand over his face, still staring at the spot where the bear had been. Rocky, his entire body still rigid with tension, finally let out a long, whimpering exhale. Max swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "What the hell was that?" James finally said, his voice hoarse. Sarah shook her head, still trying to process what had happened. "We need to go? Now." But Max, staring at the trees where the bear had vanished, felt something different. He couldn't explain it, couldn't even put it into words. The bear had looked at him, really looked at him, and for reasons he didn't understand, he felt as though it had seen something in him, something beyond fear, beyond weakness, beyond the chair he sat in. He didn't know why, but he knew one thing for sure. He would never forget that moment for the rest of his life. The night in Yellowstone wrapped itself around the cabin like a vast, breathing entity, its silence deeper than anything Max had ever known. The world outside was cast in silver and shadow, the moon hanging high above the endless stretch of forest, its light breaking through the dense canopy in fractured beams. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the coolness seeping through the cracks in the wooden walls, a reminder of how small and temporary human presence was in this ancient land. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled, its cry stretching across the valley before fading into nothingness, swallowed by the immensity of the wild. Inside, the warmth of the cabin flickered gently against the wooden walls, the fire reduced to glowing embers that pulsed like a living heart in the quiet. Shadows stretched and shifted, their edges soft and uncertain, as if they, too, were listening to the hushed conversation in the next room. Sarah and James had been talking for what felt like hours, their voices low, but carrying just enough for Max to catch fragments of their unease. "I'm telling you, James, this isn't normal. Bears don't just walk up to people like that, especially not like that," Sarah murmured, her words heavy with something unspoken, something bordering on fear. James exhaled, the weariness in his voice unmistakable. "I don't know what to make of it either. Maybe he was just curious. Maybe it saw something in him," she interrupted, her tone edged with the same uncertainty that Max had felt earlier that day. He lay still, wrapped in thick blankets, staring at the ceiling as their words settled over him. They thought he was asleep. They thought he hadn't noticed the way they had watched him after the encounter, searching for some explanation in his expression, some sign that he had felt the same overwhelming strangeness that had gripped them both. But they didn't understand. They couldn't, because Max wasn't afraid. There had been something in the way the bear had looked at him, something deep and knowing, something that had shaken him not with fear, but with recognition. He couldn't explain it, not even to himself, but he felt it as surely as he felt the pulse in his own veins. It was as if, for one brief moment, the world had shifted, narrowing to just the two of them, the boy and the beast, caught in an understanding that existed beyond words, beyond logic, beyond anything that should have made sense. Rocky stirred at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching, his nose lifting slightly as he sniffed the air. He let out a soft whimper, shifting uneasily, his tail thumping once against the floor before going still. Max frowned, glancing at him, but the dog didn't move again, his body tense but silent. Then Max heard it, soft at first, almost imperceptible beneath the rustling of leaves. A sound so deliberate, so measured, that his heart stalled in his chest before kicking into a frantic rhythm. Slow, heavy, a presence moving through the night with purpose. The air seemed to tighten, the very cabin holding its breath. Max turned his head toward the window. At first, there was nothing but darkness, endless, impenetrable. But then, as his eyes adjusted, the shadows shifted, and a shape emerged from the tree line. Massive, silent, watching. The bear. Max's breath caught. It wasn't just passing through. It wasn't wandering, searching for food, or following some instinctual path through the wilderness. It had come back, moving through the night with the same deliberate calm it had carried earlier that day. This time, though there was no distance between them, no boardwalk separating the untamed from the human, just a fragile pane of glass. It stepped forward, each movement slow and precise, its massive shoulders rolling as it closed the space between them. The moonlight caught the rough texture of its fur, the deep grooves of its muscles shifting beneath the surface like a tide waiting to break. Its breath misted in the cold air, visible in soft clouds that dissipated as quickly as they formed. Max couldn't move, not out of fear, but something else, something deeper, something that rooted him to the spot as his fingers curled into the fabric of his blanket. He should have called for his parents, should have shouted, done anything to wake them. But he didn't. He didn't want to. The bear stopped a few feet from the cabin, its dark eyes locked onto his. For a moment, nothing existed beyond that gaze. Max felt his pulse hammering, but he wasn't scared. There was no aggression in the bear's posture, no signs of unease or threat. It simply stood there, breathing, waiting, watching. Without thinking, without hesitation, Max lifted his hand and pressed it against the cold glass. The bear didn't move, didn't flinch. It only continued to look at him, its great chest rising and falling in slow, rhythmic waves, its massive head tilting ever so slightly. It was impossible, this closeness, this shared silence, this weight of something unspoken stretching between them like a bridge over an endless chasm. A creak of floorboards shattered the moment. Max's breath hitched. The sound was small, but in the stillness, it was deafening. A shift of movement in the hallway. Sarah. The bear's posture changed, just slightly, its ears flicking toward the noise, its body tensing in the subtlest way. And then, in a movement so fluid it was almost unnatural, it turned. Max's fingers twitched against the glass as he watched it retreat, its form dissolving back into the shadows, swallowed by the same darkness from which it had emerged. The night reclaimed it, leaving nothing behind but the lingering press of its presence, the ghost of its breath still hanging in the cold air. By the time Sarah appeared in his doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, the bear was gone. "Max," she murmured, her voice thick with drowsiness, but touched with concern. "What are you doing awake?" Max turned his head slowly, his palms still resting against the glass, the chill of it grounding him. "Nothing," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Rocky exhaled heavily, finally relaxing, his body sinking back against the floor as if the tension had drained from him all at once. Sarah frowned slightly, stepping further into the room, her eyes flicking toward the window. For a moment, she hesitated, studying the look on his face, the way his fingers lingered against the glass. Then, after a beat too long, she sighed. "All right," she said softly. "Try to get some sleep." She turned, disappearing back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Max alone with the remnants of something he still couldn't quite name. He glanced back toward the window, but the night stretched out before him, empty and vast. Yet he knew the bear would return. The morning after the bear's return, the world outside the cabin felt eerily unchanged, as if the night had swallowed the events whole, leaving no trace behind. The trees still stood tall and indifferent, their branches whispering in the wind. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, and the distant sounds of the wild, howling wolves, calling birds, the rustling of unseen creatures, filled the space where silence had loomed just hours before. Max sat at the wooden table in the center of the cabin, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the worn surface. The golden morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust floating in the air. His parents were moving around the small kitchen, their movements slower than usual, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking toward him every few moments. They were different this morning, more careful, more deliberate. Rocky lay curled up by the door, his tail twitching in his sleep, but Max could tell. Just like him, the dog hadn't truly rested. Something had shifted last night, something unspoken yet heavy, pressing down on all of them. Sarah placed a mug of hot chocolate in front of him, her hands lingering on the cup a moment too long before she finally pulled away. James sat across from him, his fingers clasped together, the lines on his forehead deeper than usual. Max didn't speak. He only waited. Finally, James sighed. "Max, we need to tell you something." There was the shift in the air, the tightening of something invisible. Max looked up from his untouched drink, his heartbeat steady but expectant. Sarah and James exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. It was Sarah who finally spoke. "This isn't the first time this has happened," she said, her voice careful, measured. Max frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" His mother inhaled, her fingers curling around her own mug as if it grounded her. "The bear. It wasn't the first time." Max's pulse quickened. "You mean last night?" James shook his head. "No, we mean before. A long time ago." There was something unsettling in the way his parents looked at him, something that sent a cold shiver down his spine. He had never seen them like this before, so hesitant, so uncertain, as if the truth they were about to reveal was something they had tried to bury. Sarah swallowed hard. "You were a baby, almost 1 year old. It was one of our first trips to Yellowstone as a family. We had come here just like now, staying in a cabin like this one. It was supposed to be just another visit, another summer trip. But then, something happened." Max barely blinked, his entire body locked in place. James ran a hand over his face. "We were sitting outside. You were in a little blanket on the grass, playing with some leaves. It was a quiet evening. Rocky, our first Rocky, the one before this one, was lying beside you, half asleep. Everything was normal. And then," Sarah's breath hitched, just slightly. "The bear appeared." The words fell into the space between them like stones dropped into water, rippling outward, breaking everything apart. Max felt his stomach tighten. James continued, his voice quieter now. "It was a grizzly, just like the one from yesterday. Big, unbelievably big. It came out of the trees, just walking slowly, directly toward you." Max's hands curled into fists on his lap. Sarah's fingers tightened around her mug. "We couldn't move. We couldn't breathe. It was just like yesterday," Rocky growled, "but he didn't attack. We wanted to run, to grab you, but we were frozen. It was too close. If we startled it, if we did anything." She trailed off, shaking her head. James exhaled sharply, his eyes distant, as if he were seeing it all over again. "It came right up to you. Stop, just a foot away." Max's pulse roared in his ears. Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "And then it just looked at you." The air in the cabin felt impossibly still. Max's throat was dry. "How long?" James hesitated. "Minutes. It felt like forever. But it just stood there, staring at you." Sarah let out a small, nervous laugh, one that held no real amusement. "You didn't cry. You didn't move. You just looked back at it, almost like you knew it was there, like you weren't afraid." Max didn't know what to say. James ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening, and then it turned and walked away. Just like last night, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Max tried to swallow the storm brewing inside him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah looked away. James sighed. "Because it didn't make sense. Because it was terrifying. Because it felt like something we should just forget. We told ourselves it was a coincidence. A strange, once-in-a-lifetime moment that we didn't need to think about." He exhaled. "And then last night happened." Max's hands trembled slightly, though he wasn't sure why. "It's the same bear, isn't it?" Sarah flinched. "Max, it is, isn't it?" His voice was stronger now, more certain. James hesitated, then slowly nodded. "We don't know for sure. But maybe—" Max sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The same bear, years apart, coming back, watching him. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. Something connected them. Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "We don't know what this means, Max. We just wanted you to know. We thought you deserved that." Max barely heard her. His heart was pounding, his thoughts spiraling into places he couldn't quite grasp. He thought back to last night, to the way the bear had looked at him, the way he had felt no fear, only recognition. He thought back to the moment at the meadow, to the way time had seemed to slow when their eyes had met. This had started long before he ever realized. And somehow, he knew it wasn't over. The next morning, the air was thick with the bittersweet weight of departure. The last day in Yellowstone always felt different. Not quite like an ending, but more like a slow unraveling, as if the park itself was loosening its quiet hold on them, letting them go. The golden morning light stretched across the landscape, illuminating the peaks of the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the valley below. A cool breeze carried the scent of damp earth and pine, stirring the tall grass, whispering through the trees. Max sat in his wheelchair just outside the cabin, watching as his parents packed the last of their things. The trunk of the SUV stood open, half filled with suitcases and camping gear, while Rocky paced nearby, tail wagging lazily, his nose occasionally twitching at the scents carried on the wind. Sarah sighed as she zipped up one of the bags. "We still have a few hours before we need to hit the road," she said, glancing toward Max. "I thought we could go to the lake one last time." James nodded, shutting the trunk. "Sounds good. It's always quiet this early." Max didn't argue. He wanted to go, needed to even. His mind was still tangled in the revelation from the night before, the weight of what his parents had told him pressing against his ribs like a secret too big for his body. He hadn't spoken much since that conversation, but he knew he didn't need to. The knowledge sat between them, unspoken but understood. The drive to the lake was a short one, winding through dense clusters of towering trees, past open meadows that stretched toward the horizon. The dirt road kicked up dust behind their car, the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires the only thing breaking the morning stillness. When they arrived, the lake lay before them like a sheet of glass, its surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that it looked like a second world stretched out before them. The water barely moved, only shifting where the occasional ripple disturbed its surface. Tall pines stood like silent sentinels along the shoreline, their dark silhouettes mirrored in the water. Sarah and James set up a small picnic area near the edge of the shore, spreading out a blanket and unloading snacks, while Rocky immediately bounded toward the water, his paws splashing against the shallow edges. Max, however, felt an invisible pull, something tugging him further, something drawing him away from the others. "I'm going to go over there for a bit," he said, gesturing toward a more secluded stretch of shoreline where a few large rocks jutted out into the water. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Stay where we can see you, okay?" Max didn't reply, already wheeling himself toward the spot. The ground was uneven, but he knew how to navigate it. He had done it before. He found a good place near the water's edge, the perfect spot to take out his sketchbook one last time. The sun was rising higher now, warming the cool air, making the lake shimmer. He flipped open his book, his pencil poised over the blank page, ready to capture the way the morning light danced across the ripples. Then he stopped. His breath hitched. Across the lake, on the opposite shore, a figure stood between the trees. The bear. Max's fingers tightened around his pencil. It was there, not moving, not walking, just standing at the edge of the trees, its massive form still and waiting. The distance between them was great, but it didn't matter. Their eyes met. A silence stretched across the lake, heavier than the water, thicker than the morning air. Max felt something deep in his chest, a pull, a weight, an understanding. He didn't know how or why, but he knew this moment meant something. The bear was saying goodbye. His throat felt tight, though he wasn't sure why. He had known, somehow, that this would happen, that it would come to an end, that whatever strange, silent connection had existed between them would not last beyond this place. Still, he wasn't ready for it. The bear exhaled, its breath visible in the cool morning air, rising like mist before fading into nothingness. And then, it turned. Max's chest ached in a way he couldn't explain as he watched it retreat, its massive frame disappearing between the trees, swallowed by the forest without a sound. Gone. Forever. Max didn't move, didn't blink. He just sat there, staring at the place where the bear had stood, his fingers loose around his pencil. He knew he would never see it again. But the encounter, this strange, impossible connection, would stay with him for the rest of his life. The return home felt surreal. The city was loud, suffocating in a way Max hadn't noticed before. The steady hum of traffic, the distant wail of sirens, the chatter of strangers walking past their car. It was all too fast, too chaotic, too disconnected. The air smelled different, thick with exhaust and concrete instead of pine and earth. The sky, which had stretched endlessly over Yellowstone, now felt smaller, boxed in by buildings and power lines. Max sat in the back seat, his sketchbook clutched tightly in his lap, his fingers running over the worn edges of the pages. He had barely spoken since they left the park, lost in a quiet, thoughtful silence that even his parents hesitated to disturb. Sarah glanced at him through the rearview mirror, her expression soft with concern. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Max didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure how to put it into words, the strange ache in his chest, the way Yellowstone still clung to him like an imprint, the way the bear's gaze was burned into his mind like a memory too vivid to fade. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "Different." James glanced at Sarah before nodding. "That makes sense. It was a big trip." Big. That was one way to describe it. Life-altering was another. The next few days passed in a blur. The familiar routine of home. Waking up to the sound of the neighbor's car starting, rolling into the kitchen to the smell of coffee and eggs, flipping through TV channels that all felt meaningless. None of it felt the same. Everything seemed too small, too ordinary. It was like stepping back into a world that had stayed the same while he had changed. Max found himself retreating to his room more often, poring over his sketches from Yellowstone. He had captured so much, the geysers, the rivers, the endless plains where bison roamed. But the bear, he had drawn the bear more than anything else. Page after page, its image stared back at him. Its dark, knowing eyes. The way its fur caught the light, streaked with gold and shadow. The moment by the lake, their silent farewell. Max ran his fingers over the latest sketch, his chest tightening. He couldn't let it end here. Something inside him refused to let the experience fade into just another family trip. It was more than that. It meant something, and for the first time, he knew exactly what he needed to do. He grabbed his pencil, flipped to a blank page, and started to write. At first, the words came slowly. A hesitant sentence here, a half-formed thought there. He wasn't a writer. Not really, but this wasn't about being perfect. It was about capturing what had happened, about making sense of what the bear had meant to him. It started with Yellowstone, with the first time he saw the grand prismatic spring, with the way he had always felt connected to nature in a way he couldn't explain. Then came the first encounter, the bear standing in the meadow, the way it had looked at him, not with fear, not with aggression, but with something else, something deeper. He wrote about the night it returned, about the way it had stood outside his window, silent and waiting, about the moment he had pressed his hand against the glass, feeling a connection so profound it didn't need words. And then the goodbye. As he wrote, the sketches became part of the story. Each drawing found its place between the words, bringing the moments to life in ways that description alone couldn't. The weight of the bear's presence, the stillness of the night, the quiet understanding they had shared, it all flowed onto the pages, piece by piece, until the story was complete. He didn't show anyone at first. It felt too personal, too raw. But Sarah had always known when something was on his mind, and it didn't take long before she gently nudged him toward sharing. "You've been working on something," she said one evening, sitting beside him on his bed, flipping through his sketches. "I can tell." Max hesitated. Then, without a word, he handed her the sketchbook. She read in silence, her fingers brushing over the drawings, her eyes moving carefully over every word. By the time she reached the last page, she exhaled softly, pressing the book to her chest for a moment before looking at him. "This is incredible, Max," she murmured. "You need to share this." He frowned. "It's just my story." "Yes," she said, smiling. "And that's exactly why people need to hear it." He wasn't sure what he had expected when he finally posted it online. A few kind comments, maybe. A couple of people who appreciated the drawings. but he hadn't expected it to spread the way it did. People shared it. A lot. Strangers reached out, talking about how they had never thought about nature that way before. Wildlife organizations messaged him, asking if they could feature his story. A local newspaper picked it up, writing about the boy who met the bear. And then someone bigger noticed. A national wildlife magazine contacted his parents, asking if they could interview Max, if they could publish his drawings, if they could help spread his story. Max sat in the living room, staring at the email, his hands shaking slightly. James laughed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, kid, looks like you're famous." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "You wanted to tell your story, Max. And now, people are listening." The magazine article was just the beginning. Soon, schools invited him to speak, first locally, then in other cities. His parents traveled with him, watching as he rolled on stages in front of classrooms filled with wide-eyed kids, telling them about the bear, about Yellowstone, about how important it was to respect and protect wildlife. He never expected to become a voice for something bigger than himself. But he did. One afternoon, after yet another event, he sat in his room, looking at the newest letter that had arrived, a message from a national conservation group, asking if he wanted to work with them on a campaign to raise awareness for wildlife protection. Max traced his fingers over the words, his mind drifting back to Yellowstone, back to the bear. He would never see it again. But somehow, that didn't feel like a loss. The bear had given him something greater than a memory. It had given him a purpose, and he wasn't going to waste it